Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. In between this episode and episode 16, we recorded conversations with 5 very interesting practitioners. And we placed those as interludes in and among the episodes leading up to episode 16. Now, Peter and I have a conversation about what we learned about practice because we had these really lively conversations, and what we look forward to in further conversations with other practitioners as 2020 unfolds. There are a couple of conjectures that came to mind, and I will report that after we turned off the recording, Peter said, "Gee, I think we've become practice practitioners. Our practice is now practice itself." And I thought, yeah, it sure is. So we'll pick up on that thread the next time Peter and I resume recording. Our practice is practice, with a question mark, because there's so much more to be learned. Stay with us. Here we are, episode 17. Well, Peter, our listeners may not be aware that when we had the last conversation between just the two of us, it was at the end of recording a number of our episodes and before we actually started including a practitioner in conversations. But now we've done that. But when we talked about doing it, we thought, how are we going to be sure that we're not using that precious time, their precious time, just to tell them what we think practice is and get them to agree or disagree? We needed to have a lighter hand. In fact, I think one of the things you said very clearly when they listened to episode 16 was that we have to listen with genuine curiosity and interest. Genuine. They'll pick it up if we aren't. If this was just a staged event, in so many words.
Yeah.
So
I feel that very, very deeply.
So how did we do on that? How do you feel overall? We talked to 5 different people so far. We're going to talk to some more in the future. Let's give ourselves either a commendation or some advice for how to do better in future conversations.
Well, I don't know. I don't have a lot of impressions on that particular question. I will say that you might say that there's a negative index of how we've done.
Okay.
Might be that our respondents are 5. It's 5, isn't it? That we've had our five people that we've talked with, conversation partners have not felt they needed to correct us or disagree with us at all on any of our own speculations. All through your conversation and mine with me, we called them conjectures, and so the negative index is they did not, any of them, feel they needed to get conjecturing with us. We didn't draw them into the capital P practice conversation, inadvertently draw them into the capital P practice conversation. And to me, that tells me, anyway, that we did keep them thinking about their own practice primarily. In fact, as I think back over it, I can't remember any of the 5 who exhibited much consciousness of what other people in their situations are doing. And again, that's a kind of negative index. that, at least in our conversations, they weren't really worried about whether they're doing it right, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Our plant manager, John Ulani, does I have his name right? Is it
Giuliani? Yep.
Ulani? In particular, has a lot of confidence. He's a middle-aged practicing manager and has a track record. He's not in the least in doubt about his own ability as a leader. I don't think. I didn't get
all.
any of that from him.
Humble, but not in doubt.
Yes,
there's a difference.
Yes, absolutely. And so they went. In that regard, the interviews went the way I personally had hoped they would go. That was, we just kept talking about them and the way their work and their opportunities look to them, the way they, I keep saying, putting it to myself, the way they think of their practice, including whether they think of it as a practice at all, which is kind of another subject. I think John thought of his work as a practice, but I'm not sure the others.
Well, Steve Meisel had it kind of easy, in that he and I and you are teachers, and
that's right.
He was, there wasn't a sense of in my recollection of Steve talking where he projected anything like that. But the others, it wasn't quite as easy for each of the others. Christina and Jackie, even Brittany, because she's a student, but she's about not to be, and she's about to move into a whole, new phase of her life. John, from the very first day I met him, when he was my student back in the 90s, had that clarity of focus. This is what he wants to do, meaning he wants to be out in the shop floor helping people take themselves not only more seriously, but believe in themselves, because that's where he felt that the best results for any business were going to come, when the workforce was that engaged, and he really did from the 2 years that he's been out there make that workforce over in their own best image, which I think was quite remarkable. But yeah, I was, I think we had said, and they can listen to episode 16. Let's be sure now that, because I'm saying this to me, as you can tell right now, I could talk till the cows come home, and that would have been of little benefit to our listeners or to us as learners, because we use these conversations with others to deepen our own, I don't know what the word would be, not so much beliefs and practice, but deepen our desire to keep thinking about it and sharing our thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just sitting here thinking about what a more purely academic approach to this whole subject might be. And for me, it would go something like this, that you would have a few general conjectures. You'd say to yourself, hey, I think there's a, beyond the way all these practitioners I've worked with talk, there's kind of a general something. There is a general sense of what practice is. They're not saying it to themselves, but they're behaving it. And I'm getting that there's a general sense of what practice is running through their work. Hey, I'll give it a capital P and really run with this ball. And when an academic runs with this ball, what he or she does is goes and gets some grant money from their dean or from the faculty research fund, or maybe from a company that's interested in the same question, goes out and interviews a whole bunch of practitioners, comes back, begins sifting through puts it on 3x5 cards or has some other data display device, spreadsheets or whatever, begins to formulate middle level, you might call them middle level generalizations about practice that can be reported on from what all these different interviews are saying. By no means, in fact, an academic with a real purist approach to all of this would shy away from making any conjectures that aren't supported by the data.
Yeah, that's true.
The conjectures have to grow out of the data.
Yeah.
And I'm taking this little side trip, Dave, because I can imagine listeners who are themselves primarily practitioners wouldn't realize the alternative way of proceeding that exists and that is more common among our colleagues in the academic world than the way we're going about this. So I want our listeners to understand kind of what our conjectures are, that they are conjectures and they probably will remain conjectures.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, and at some point, a body of data will begin to accumulate that we or someone else might then begin to test more rigorously against the conjectures. But the conjectures, in my mind, what they really are is just ways of tuning me up, and maybe you too, to listen, tuning me up to listen, and listen for things that I have not ever thought of before in the subject of practice. That's really what this conversation here this afternoon is what have we been listening for? What have we heard that we may not have thought of before or been sensitive to before? So then these practitioners, friends of ours, and maybe us in a different point in our lives, professional lives, take this body of data we've accumulated and select out interviews that are paragraphs and sentences and words from the interviews that dramatize one point or another that we think can be supported in the data, and pull it all together, write it up, depending on who we're thinking of sending it to, write it up for the Harvard Business Review or write it up for the Administrative Science Quarterly or whoever, however competitive we're thinking of being in publishing this thing. Maybe even make a book out of it. That's
there's a thought.
what Tom Peters did with Excellence was to write an article for Business Week in which he just sketched his eight generalizations about excellence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, simple form, lean staff. I've forgotten what they all are now.
Loose, tight.
Loose, tight controls. Decision
they were
making.
catchy.
push. Yeah, well, that's was Tom Peters' genius.
It was
making it exciting. But anyway, he then, when Business Week told him that his article on excellence was the single largest requested reprint that they'd ever had, he said, and for his McKinsey colleagues, because he was a McKinsey employee.
That's right.
For his McKinsey colleagues, he got the support to write this book. And Harper and Row, their initial press run was 5,000 copies, and their the initial sales was 5 million. And Tom, at that point, thought he might have something here.
Yeah.
Um,
If only us, Peter, we'd be living in high in high in the cotton and high cotton.
no, he'd be. As I heard it, he's up in New Hampshire someplace.
I think so, or in Vermont. I'm not sure where, but yeah,
Uh,
he and if those what you've just described, if that was our motive, you and me, we would definitely be going about this very differently. And we haven't abandoned the manuscript that
no,
supported
no.
what brought us into this. The conjectures, by and large, are all written down. At some point, we may just get back and put it in a more traditional form. In the meantime, what I've discovered now, particularly with these interviews or in these conversations with practitioners, is that it's really fun. So I want to, and I think we're having fun doing this, but it's seriously fun in that I've known each of these people so far, and I'm going to meet people that as we bring in some of your friends and colleagues as we go forward. I've known them, and I I have a deep affection for each of them. And why? In particular, because I know that they are results driven for sure, but not driven people. They love results. They set a much higher bar for themselves. And this is a pattern, I think, of all the ones we've talked with so far, than any corporate bar has been set for them.
Yes.
And they just keep raising that bar. So here's one quick thread that I thought of as we were reflecting on those conversations. In every case, including Meisel, who's paid to be a learner for his whole career, they're fiercely committed to learning.
Yeah.
They will not let something block or minimize or even certify their learning to the extent that it holds them to a certain point. They just want to keep going and growing. Did you pick up on that? Think of
Um,
Christina and
yeah.
Jackie.
All of them. That so many times a person runs into something they don't understand,
Mhm.
and so they back away from it, and they put it in the round file, or they somehow avoid the learning that this new technology or this new individual person or this new job opportunity, that they avoid the learning that it would promise. This goes back to one of my, as you know, one of my concerns about higher education is that we don't have higher education does not have a way of thinking itself about learning that it can then begin to impart to students generally in all fields, so that students graduate as more effective learners than they were when they came in.
That's right.
They don't, in yours and my language in these podcasts, higher education does not succeed in imparting learning as a practice to students. They don't have learning as a practice. These individuals that you're talking about, that we've talked to, clearly have learning as a practice, and will, and the younger ones will deepen and thicken and enrich this practice as they go along, so that they will be 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, they will be really powerful learners, and
Yes.
and they will therefore be qualified for jobs that require powerful learning abilities.
Yes.
And whether it's senior executive positions or uh, senior positions in government or political activity, or segueing over to the academic world, endowed chairs and things like that, they will be more powerful learners, and that's that's uh, that's impressive thing to see, and very gratifying as an academic when you realize that you have affected somebody that way.
Oh, yeah.
The person you quoted to me a few minutes ago before we came on the air, the person you quoted to me as enjoying conversations with me personally,
Yeah.
that's an enormously gratifying thing to hear. Frankly, I've heard it several times in my career, and every time I've heard it, I have just glowed, because it's what I'm hoping for my effect to be on my learners and on my colleagues. I'm not just whistling Dixie
No,
with these folks.
not at all. In fact, I asked you once when we were working through the original manuscript that you have been putting together over the last years, actually. I said, I asked you about your writing style, and because I've always had, I don't know what it would be, some ridiculous writer's block that would come up from time to time when I had to write in the format or in the style to which I was not accustomed and never would be. And so, as I've mentioned several times in our podcast, I broke loose from that and wrote a story, a book-length story, to be able to get my thoughts across. But you also said that you write as you talk. I mean, in a way, in your writings, your essays, while they were certainly formal enough to pass the muster, it was conversational in the best sense of the word. As the thoughts came to you, wrote them down, and they came to flow together. So as a conversationalist in your writing, in your speaking, formally and informally, Peter, you do have that effect. And I'd like to say, to some degree, so do I. And probably that's why
I think you do.
That's why we kind of wanted to break loose and try this this podcasting thing.
Yes.
In fact, as I've been trying to anchor this in some work that my son Dave did for his doctorate, and so we can include him in some of our thinking going forward, he studied very, very carefully studied the nature of conversation. He was a conversational analyst, and he's looking at the nitty-gritty turns of talk and how social phenomena were enacted in the way people talk with each other with intention. So back to the point, though, when we bring these folks in, as we have, what the feedback I would get in each case when I'd reach back and thank them was, wow, that was really wonderful to talk with you too. You really seemed interested. I said, did you think we wouldn't be?
Yeah, I know. They
don't know
myself.
You. They didn't know you. They thought, well, maybe you were going to come across some, like judge of of their every word, and not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, you were very appreciative, are appreciative. And I think that is partly what you've described in the way you've done your research your whole career. And as an organizational development consultant, you're appreciative. You let people breathe. You certainly do for me.
As I listen to you, I've just formulated a new conjecture about practice.
Wait a minute, let me get this written down now. I got to write this down. Okay, go ahead. What is it?
Well, the conjecture, because I've run into it, I don't know, I guess I want to say many times, from practitioners. And the conjecture is, well, what I hear from practitioners is there's nothing particularly interesting about my job. And the conjecture, kind of generalizing that one of the things about practice is that it is so, a practitioner at work is in such an interior state of consciousness that he or she tends to feel that other people can't understand it and are not interested in it. And that's where what has crept into the language in the last few years, the elevator version of my job, of my work.
Oh, I know.
And
it just bugs me.
And what that reflects is a general feeling that you have a sort of simple-minded summary of your work that you can convey in an elevator, and but then you really have what your work really means to you and really entails, and that can't be communicated is sort of the assumption.
Certainly not in 60 seconds.
Yeah, and and so I'm sitting here with my conjecture, kind of what is it about practice that leads practitioners to feel that no one can really understand what I do, and that is, I'm not trying to solve that problem. I'm just conjecturing that that's a characteristic of practice, is that it engenders that feeling. No one can understand really what I do. That's my conjecture.
Yeah, but I don't think that is. I think you could flip that on two sides. One side is I'm so wonderful that no one could possibly understand
No, I
what
don't
I
think
do.
I don't think
Not at
that's
all.
not
If
that's not the intention at all.
the flip side is what you do intend, which is it's ineffable. It's hard to speak,
Yeah, so the
and
flip side is that the true meaning can't be intended, or can't be publicly reported on and displayed. Uh,
certainly not in easy fashion. And yet, on the other hand, what we've learned in listening five different people is that something does come through. In fact, your advisory when we started this on episode 16 was just ask them something like, "What was the last thing that you did before you came on, the camera to talk with us?" So we could give them a starting point. I think that's one of the dilemmas, Peter. If you said before, you can't talk about something that means so much that it's deep in your identity in a very crisp way, but you can get into it by starting to talk about what's happening, what you're doing, what it means to you, in what context. And pretty soon, you got some pretty lively give and take. Don't you agree?
yeah, yeah, and I had another thought when you were talking. What was it? Oh, the idea of arrogance about it. I'm so great. I'm so special. No one can understand what I do. I don't think that's very common at all. That in an arrogant sense. Maybe it is, but
I haven't come. I don't work. I
I,
don't relate well to people who come across that way. So I don't have many occasions where I find that sort of downward look of the eye. Down
yeah,
to the level of the person asking. If anything, as you'll see, the people that I bring to our conversations are they in some ways underrate themselves from my standpoint, knowing their long histories of what they've been through.
they take themselves for granted, and they're humble about it.
Hmm.
Um, I
What?
come to think of it, I can report. Somebody I'm talking to in an organization will report that some other people elsewhere in the organization are terribly arrogant about what they're doing and think they're the cat's meow and all of this. You hear this said resentfully by non-tech practitioners, speaking of those who really understand all this stuff.
Hmm.
That some of them think they're just such hot stuff, uh, usually with an expletive substituted for stuff. Uh, and I've heard nurses say this about surgeons repeatedly. The surgeons think they are so special, and they are so arrogant about their practice.
There are some practices that may develop that in a person simply because they're holding someone's life in their hands. Who knows?
Well,
But
yes,
but I know that through my daughter being a surgical OR nurse, that there's plenty of spectrum there too. Some people that are surgeons who are just really hard to be with, and then there are others who aren't, but they're all doing the same work. One of the
It's
things that
interesting. Is she a member of the Association of Operating Room Nurses? Do you know?
I don't know. If so, I should know. But
Well, ask her the next time you're talking to her. It's a very lively professional society.
oh,
I did some work with them back some years ago, and they are under the gun. They're under the gun. The patient's life is at risk. They're on the table, and the surgeon that they're supporting has various personal characteristics that make him or her somewhat hard to work with sometimes.
oh yeah,
They hold themselves to very high professional standards.
everyone does in that room, and sometimes you're standing in a spacesuit, as I call it, mask up with it. That now that for sometimes 10 or 12 hours. Sometimes you because of the operation is so critical and goes beyond its planned time, that you're there for long periods of time. There's no question that's a fascinating group of practitioners. I know my daughter wouldn't do this. She wouldn't come on, probably not, but she'd have a lot, and they can't really talk very much about anything that they're doing by virtue of their code. But one of the things that I'm thinking now about, just almost by coincidence, each of the folks that we've talked to so far were just on the cusp of leaving years and years of experience in one context, one corporate context. Christina with an health insurer, Jackie with a big global distributor. Even John, who's relatively new to this organization, has changed context. What endures in each case is who they are to themselves, what they know they put forward through their practice to the world. And in each case, they've had to compete to get the jobs that they were able to move to. Now, Christine is officially at United Technologies, working in. Jackie is now officially working for Luhek Associates in or employee development arena. Brittany couldn't tell us during that time what company was going to employ her for her first job after her doctorate, and it is Travelers. Now we know that, but she had to be competitive to get into their highly selective leadership development program, and on it goes. So what seems to be a thread for each of them is a kind of confidence that is not arrogance, but it sure as heck isn't hiding their light under a bushel either, or they never could have made it out into those new roles. Each role, by the way, being more challenging than the one they're leaving.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thought on that?
Well, I think it's a good perception. To be a constant learner is inevitably going to take you into new contexts and open doors for you, and almost by definition close other doors, which there may be some regret to leaving present contexts. In fact, we have a young woman right here where I'm living, one of the nurses' aides, clearly head and shoulders above everybody else in her ability and her motivation and the quality of care that she gives. And she's been telling us for the last week now that she's moving to a new context. We're going to lose her, and she's feels kind of regretful about that. Feels very, very regretful, in fact, because she's been in direct patient care, and so she's saying goodbye to a lot of people who's she's done the most conceivable personal things with, and she thinks, although we're all 50 years older than she is, we're her children, and she's leaving them, and so it's a palpable feeling.
Yeah,
but I've experienced it myself a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
I experienced it when I went from Connecticut to George Washington University. So it is the price you pay.
Yeah.
There are certainly positions, and you and I have found those positions. You didn't move around nearly as much as I did,
No.
but there are positions where the learning opportunities and challenges that have no upper limit, and you, I think you would agree with me. It's hard to imagine a more rewarding position than being a fully engaged teacher of this material that you and I are specialized in, human behavior and organizations.
Well, in so many words, isn't that how Steve Meisel, toward the end of our conversation, said very clearly that for 40 years, he's been able to not only do that in the classroom, which he does wonderfully, but he's been a developer of our associations. He just believes in the work. And yet he made a decision to do the phase down. And I know he threshed that out. There's no age limit really in our work that you can teach well into your 70s. I was 73 when I finally said I can't sustain my level the way I want to. But anyway, but Steve was very clear when he said, I'm just going to find other ways to do what I love, which is teaching. And he didn't mean I'm going to sign up for more courses once I'm fully retired. He might. It's a choice. But he looked at what you and I are doing. In fact, he told me this before the podcast. He said, "You guys are still teaching, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah. We don't have the benefit of instant feedback from our podcast. We'll get some comments, but yeah. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Is this not the way we're going on and teaching, Peter?"
Oh yeah, I think so. I think so. I've said many times I would still be teaching at St. Thomas at 83 had I not been laid low by a wheelchair.
Yeah. And I suspect,
and there are certainly professors who could teach very well from a wheelchair as long as I was willing to be a talking head.
yeah,
I could still be doing it, but
yeah.
I'm able to be a talking head in these podcast environments where it's a little different situation.
Well, I'd like to say that it's interactive the way we're doing this. That's the piece. If you were simply a lecturer and you recorded and they played your lectures, out in the blackboard or something, that's one thing, and it would definitely getting your very valuable thoughts out there. But what I think is constitutes teaching in this format is we're interacting, and we're interacting with a clear understanding that someone's going to listen to this. So we have a third ear, or a fifth ear, if we count all four of ours. It's listening is saying, are what we saying with each other going to be of some learning benefit to those who would listen to this episode, which we're almost ready to conclude by time. So far, I think the answer is yes, because we do this as teachers. And there's a scholarly dimension to it, back to your earliest point in this conversation. And there are more ways that we can do things going forward. But we are also recognizing the constraints, which is something we've talked about in practice. You have to be contextual. And if there are certain constraints that keep you from doing things about which you're most used and know for sure you're going to succeed, then you work around it. But let's go back to the last point, learning as a practice. The people we've talked to so far, including Steve, said nothing is going to stop my learning. There may be some change in my employment status or some other conditions that are beyond my control or even within my control, but no one can get in the way of what I want to find out next. And I'm not even sure what that is yet, but I just don't want anyone to tell me, no, you can't do it that way. You can't think it that way. You can't be of value to others unless you do it specifically on our terms. So I guess being a bit of a rebel myself over these years, I admire people who have that fight in them. I can think of even someone in your direct family who I've Noah, have known for a long while, since she was 10, your daughter Emily. Not to get too personal, but and I feel the same way about my two kids and Tim. They just they're not going to let anyone tell them that they can't learn something new. Am I right?
Oh yeah, sure.
So I think we've set a good example for our progeny. So we are recording in 2020 now. The last time we talked about bringing on people into our conversation was at the end of 2019. So this is fairly far into 2020. We have some other folks that we're starting to line up for some week by week conversations. So I hope our listeners will look forward to that, what we call interlude within the stream of episodes that are there for them to hear. And we also hope that we'll be hearing from our listeners more, that now that I've got a web page set up where they can give us comments, and that'll all be made more clear in the next podcast, how to go about doing that. Here we are, 2020. We're still kicking and taking names. Last thoughts before we close off this conversation.
Last thoughts before we close off this conversation. I'm thinking that we need some more mature managers like John. I'd like to get particularly some women who have been having themselves tested in the world of the firing line and the trenches. We're living in a period when more and more women are becoming CEOs and other high senior level positions. I have a practitioner I'm thinking of who's a woman that I am hoping we might introduce here. And I won't say any more than that. But she knows a lot about her own practice and about the practices of other women. Let me just leave it at that. So let's just flag that I'm going to be trying to recruit her for one of our conversations.
I think the key word there was people who are being tested.
Yeah.
Tested on a day-to-day basis beyond their comfort level. Yeah, I think that would be, and that was certainly true and is true of John and the others for that matter. But sure, let's be sure that we include her.
No men in no MBA programs that you and I are familiar with, no men are wondering what it's going to be like in the Me Too environment of the fast-paced corporation, where women are going to be looked at as sexual objects as well as business colleagues. Men don't worry about being seen as a sexual object, I don't think.
No.
And what's coming out now with the Me Too movement is how profoundly that affects you when you have been harassed that way. I always remember a very vivid conversation that I provoked in one of my classes, where I asked, we played around and got a definition that everybody was comfortable with for what is meant by sexual harassment. And then I said, okay, I had about 35 people, and maybe somewhere between 1/3 and a half of them were women. I said, in other words, a good sample of each sex. I said, how many men in this room today have been harassed this way? in the last, I think I picked 48 hours, and no hands went up.
No.
And I said, how many women have been harassed this way? And I had to coax a little bit. Come on now, we won't hold it against you. We'll be your friends. Nobody will think less of you. Gradually, I guess I coaxed maybe 12 or 15 hands
Within
up.
2 days?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I thought maybe there were another half dozen that just didn't want to share that about themselves.
That's extraordinary, but not extraordinary in the sense of what, the media is telling us about the experience of women. But that's stunning. And that does have a bearing on how a person will practice something they
Yeah.
love to do. That definitely has
Yeah.
bearing. Yeah. Talk
And
about constraints.
so I don't want our podcasts, let me put it this way, I don't want our podcast to be conducted unaware of this reality about woman practitioners, that at least some of them are going to have to cope with this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And are.
And I'm sure some could tell us stories about how I gave up a whole career and went over into another track entirely because there were just too many guys in the career path that I was on who wanted to get their hands on me. Too many types of guys who wanted to get their hands on me.
It's definitely a dimension that we have not, about which we have not yet done much conjecturing. So that's it's an important aspect.
I'm having a learning experience even here as I speak, realizing that. So that's at least one final thought.
Okay.
So I don't know. I guess that's probably good enough. I've said enough.
I think it definitely is. And that means that to our listeners, here they are in the middle of February 2020, and they're still thinking together about how they can make this experience for the listener more meaningful and richer, in the sense that now we've seen some dimension. We just talked about learning as a practice. We're now talking about the differences that women experience in their practice because of their women, because they're women. Yeah, we've got a lot to learn ahead, Peter, and I look forward to our next conversation.
We might even find a practitioner, probably a woman, who would teach you and me as men how to listen to female practitioners, and maybe extending that thought, we need somebody to help us how to listen to minority practitioners.
That's right.
Who aren't the minority anymore.
All right, I've got my assignment. I'm going to my Rolodex. But thank you again for another very interesting 45 minutes, Peter, and we'll talk soon.